At 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands in August 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiral into the Pacific. 3 Japanese Zeros had bounced them from above, and now Bong was alone with the lead Zero closing on his tail. He executed the textbook defensive maneuver, a hard right bank with full throttle, attempting to outclimb the threat, but the Zero turned tighter. The Japanese pilot was already sliding into firing position, and Bong had perhaps 4 seconds before 20 mm cannon fire tore through his aircraft. What happened next wasn't in any training manual. Bong rolled his P-38 completely inverted and yanked the stick forward. Instead of climbing away from the threat, his aircraft dove toward the ocean. But because he was upside down, he pulled away in a direction the Zero pilot never anticipated. Blood rushed to his head. His vision went red at the edges. For 2 critical seconds, he could barely read his instruments. When he rolled level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero was above him, overshooting, completely out of position. Bong had survived, and he just stumbled onto a tactic that would reshape air combat across the Pacific theater. This maneuver violated every principle taught at flight school. Instructors at training bases in California and Arizona specifically warned against negative G-flight, engine failure, structural damage, pilot incapacitation. The official position was clear. Yet in actual combat, when a Zero pilot had achieved firing position, those warnings mattered less than immediate survival. The pilots who lived through their first encounters with Zeros learned a harsh lesson. Conventional aerial combat doctrine was getting Americans killed. Japanese aviators had refined their tactics through years of combat operations over China. They understood every advantage their Mitsubishi A6M possessed. American pilots were dying because they fought according to peacetime training against an enemy who had already discarded those rules. The story of inverted flight tactics represents something beyond standard military history. Between 1942 and 1944, a relatively small group of fighter pilots discovered that the human body could withstand physiological stresses aviation medicine considered impossible. They learned their aircraft could handle maneuvers engineers insisted would cause structural failure. Most importantly, they proved that sometimes survival required flying directly toward the threat rather than away from it. This wasn't the sanitized version of Pacific air combat that appeared in official after-action reports. This was desperate, brutal innovation born from unforgiving necessity, where split-second decisions separated pilots who returned to base from those who became names on casualty lists. The Mitsubishi A6M0 entered combat over China in 1940. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, Japanese pilots had accumulated thousands of combat hours perfecting their tactics. The Zero's performance characteristics created a deadly problem for Allied aviators. At speeds below 300 mph, the Zero could outturn virtually any fighter in the sky. Its turning radius at combat speeds was roughly 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning and nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a traditional turning dogfight, the kind emphasized in American training programs, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his opponent's turn and achieve a firing solution within seconds. Early engagement reports from the Philippines and Java told a grim story. American pilots attempted boom and zoom tactics, diving on Zeros from altitude, firing, then climbing away. But if the initial attack failed to destroy the target, the Zero pilot would simply enter a tight horizontal turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, he found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy, becoming the target instead of the hunter. By mid-1942, kill ratios in some sectors favored Japanese pilots 3-1. Squadron commanders were filing reports that essentially admitted the same thing: we cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. The F-4F Wildcat, flown by Navy and Marine pilots, had superior diving speed and could absorb more battle damage, but its rate of roll was sluggish. The P-40 Warhawk performed well in vertical maneuvers but suffered at higher altitudes where many engagements occurred. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines and heavy firepower, but its wide turning radius made it vulnerable in horizontal combat. Each American fighter type had advantages: firepower, armor, dive speed, but none could match the Zero's agility in conventional maneuvering combat. Pilots were told to use their aircraft's strengths, avoid turning engagements, maintain energy advantage. Sensible advice, but combat rarely unfolded according to plan. What made this tactical crisis worse was the skill level of Japanese naval aviators in 1942 and early 1943. Many had been flying combat missions since the late 1930s. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics at an expert level. They knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where the Zero's turning ability became decisive. A common Japanese tactic involved one Zero acting as bait, flying straight and level, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot committed to the attack, two more Zeros would drop from above or slide in from the flanks. The American fighter was suddenly defensive, and defensive meant entering a turning fight, which meant the Zero's advantages became overwhelming. The mathematics of turning combat are unforgiving. Turn radius depends on velocity and G-force loading. The Zero's lightweight construction, achieved partly by eliminating armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it superior turn performance. American fighters carried armor plate behind the pilot seat, self-sealing tanks, heavier armament. These features kept pilots alive when hit, but they also added hundreds of pounds that increased wing loading and expanded turning radius. American pilots were essentially asked to defeat an opponent who owned the most important advantage in dogfighting, while flying aircraft optimized for survivability rather than maneuverability. The maneuver that would eventually save countless American lives wasn't derived from aeronautical engineering textbooks or tactical doctrine. It emerged from raw desperation and accidental discovery. The splittess, as it came to be called, involved rolling inverted and pulling through into a diving turn. In normal flight, pilots experience positive G-forces. Blood is pushed toward their feet. Vision narrows, and at around 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots experience grey out or blackout. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward, he experiences negative Gs. Blood rushes to the head. The effect is called red out because the visual field literally turns red as blood vessels in the eyes engorge. Aviation medicine in 1942 suggested humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces. Studies indicated that even -2 Gs caused severe discomfort, disorientation, and potential retinal damage. Official guidance recommended avoiding negative G flight entirely. But these studies were conducted in controlled environments with test pilots who weren't being shot at. Combat created different mathematics. A pilot experiencing 2 seconds of red out vision but escaping a Zero's gun solution survived. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight but stayed in the Zero's crosshairs died. The choice wasn't comfortable versus uncomfortable. It was temporary blindness versus permanent death. The physics behind why the inverted dive worked involved energy management and opponent prediction. When a Zero pilot achieved a tail position, he anticipated the target would either try to outturn him, impossible, or attempt to climb away, which bled the American aircraft's energy and made it an easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't expect. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow through the maneuver, his aircraft faced structural limitations. The Zero was stressed for positive G, loads up to about 7 Gs, but its lighter construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling negative Gs in a Zero risked structural failure or engine problems because the aircraft systems weren't designed for sustained inverted flight. The P-38's twin Allison engines had another advantage in negative G flight. Unlike single engine fighters with carbureted engines which could experience fuel starvation during inverted maneuvers. The P-38's engines used different fuel systems that functioned more reliably under negative G-loads. This wasn't a designed feature. Lockheed engineers weren't planning for inverted combat tactics, but it became operationally significant. A P-38 pilot could maintain power through an inverted dive, while some pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss, widening the separation. The human body's tolerance for negative G forces turned out to be higher than medical literature suggested, provided the exposure was brief. Pilots reported that the red-out effect lasted only a few seconds during a properly executed split-S. Vision returned as the aircraft transitioned back to positive G-flight during the pullout. The discomfort was intense, headaches, facial fatigue, bloodshot eyes, but survivable. Several pilots noted in debriefings that they'd rather endure a splitting headache back at base than a proper burial at sea. The informal risk assessment was simple. Negative G maneuvers hurt, but Japanese cannons hurt worse. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, was the first pilot documented to have used the inverted dive tactic deliberately rather than instinctively. On April 11, 1943, Lynch led a four-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf when his formation encountered 8 Zeros at 20,0 feet. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal fight, Lynch immediately rolled inverted when the lead Zero closed on him. He pulled through into a steep dive, accelerated to over 400 mph, then rolled level at 8,0 feet. The Zero pilot attempting to follow pulled out at 12,0 feet, either unwilling or unable to match Lynch's dive angle and speed. Lynch didn't just survive the encounter, he reversed the situation. After leveling out, he had both altitude separation and superior speed. He used that energy advantage to climb back up, this time approaching the now disorganized Japanese formation from below. The Zeros had lost their cohesion, chasing after what they thought were fleeing American fighters. Lynch shot down 2 Zeros in the ensuing engagement. His wingman, following his example through the inverted dive, survived without losses. The after-action report noted the tactic but didn't emphasize it. Official doctrine still discouraged negative G maneuvers. What made Lynch's actions significant was intentionality. Other pilots had rolled inverted under duress, survived, and chalked it up to luck. Lynch recognized it as a repeatable technique. Within a week, he was teaching the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron during informal briefings. The instruction was simple. If a Zero gets on your tail in a position where you can't shake him conventionally, roll inverted, pull through, dive hard, and use the speed to separate. Don't try to outturn him horizontally. Use the vertical dimension. The Zero owns the horizontal circle, but American fighters owned the vertical dive. By June 1943, the tactic had spread to other P-38 units operating out of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared the technique during ready room discussions and inter-squadron debriefings. It remained largely unofficial, not prohibited, but not endorsed in formal tactical directives either. Squadron leaders recognized its effectiveness but hesitated to put it in writing. The concern was partly liability. If a pilot was killed attempting the maneuver, questions would arise about who authorized teaching a tactic that contradicted established training. So it spread through word of mouth, experienced pilots showing new arrivals how to execute it without documenting the instruction. The 475th Fighter Group, arriving in the Southwest Pacific in August 1943, received informal briefings on the inverted dive tactic from veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles MacDonald, who would eventually become one of the Pacific Theater's leading aces with 27 kills, later credited the split-S maneuver with saving his life on at least 3 occasions. His combat reports from late 1943 show a pattern. Engage Zeros from altitude, make a high-speed pass. If counterattacked during the climb, back up, roll inverted and dive away. reset the engagement on favorable terms. It wasn't elegant dogfighting, it was industrial, strength survival mathematics that happened to produce victory. The physiological cost of negative G flight was something no training manual adequately prepared pilots for. During a typical split-S maneuver, pulling -2 to -3 Gs, blood pressure in the head increased dramatically. Pilots reported an immediate sensation of intense pressure behind the eyes, followed by the red out effect where their entire visual field turned crimson. The pressure came from blood vessels in the retina and conjunctiva, engorging with blood forced upward by the negative acceleration. For those 2 to 3 seconds, a pilot was effectively flying blind, relying on kinesthetic sense and instrument memory to maintain aircraft control. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, documented the physical aftermath of these maneuvers. He examined dozens of pilots who regularly employed inverted dive tactics. Nearly all showed petechial hemorrhaging, tiny broken blood vessels creating red spots across their faces, particularly around the eyes and forehead. Some experienced subconjunctival hemorrhages that left their eyes blood red for days. Severe headaches were universal. A few pilots reported temporary vision problems, blurred sight, or difficulty focusing that lasted several hours after landing. Moorhead's unofficial conclusion, never published in medical journals, was that the maneuvers caused measurable physical damage, but nothing permanently debilitating. The greater risk was the moment of blindness itself. During those few seconds of redout, a pilot couldn't see his altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. He certainly couldn't see the enemy aircraft or the ground rushing up. The maneuver required absolute commitment. A pilot had to establish the dive angle, pull the negative Gs, then hold that control input until his vision cleared, trusting that he judged his altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal accidents in training occurred when pilots initiated the maneuver too low or held the dive too long. There was no margin for error at 5,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, a pilot had time to correct. The mathematical calculation became part of survival: never go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death was otherwise certain. Experienced pilots developed techniques to minimize the red out duration. Some learned to tense their neck and facial muscles, attempting to restrict blood flow to the head. Others discovered that if they rolled inverted but pulled less aggressively on the stick, trading maximum maneuver performance for slightly better vision, they could maintain partial sight throughout the maneuver. This became a judgment call. Maximum negative G input generated the fastest separation from a pursuing zero, but caused complete visual blackout. Moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to keep some visual reference, but reduced the effectiveness of the escape. In practice, most chose maximum separation. Better to be blind for 3 seconds and alive than semi-aware and shot down. The psychological aspect was equally challenging. Human beings have strong evolutionary instincts against actions that cause pain and sensory deprivation. Voluntarily inducing temporary blindness while someone is trying to kill you runs counter to every survival instinct. Yet pilots learn to override that instinct. The first time was terrifying. The second time was still frightening. By the 5th or 6th time, it became just another unpleasant aspect of combat flying, like flak, like fuel management, like watching friends die. The body adapted, the mind adapted. What seemed impossible in a training environment became routine, when the alternative was a 20 mm cannon shell through the cockpit. The inverted dive tactic moved through the Pacific theater like an underground transmission, spreading from squadron to squadron without ever appearing in official tactical publications. By September 1943, P-38 units across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their first week in country. The instruction happened informally. Veteran pilots taking new arrivals aside after evening mess, describing what worked and what got people killed. Squadron commanders knew it was happening. Some actively encouraged it. Others pretended not to notice. maintaining plausible deniability in case 5th Air Force Headquarters asked uncomfortable questions about unauthorized training. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, incorporated the split S into his its tactical doctrine in October 1943. The P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, making it hopelessly outmatched in turning combat against Zeros, but the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its radial engine handled negative G flight reasonably well. Kirby's approach was pragmatic. He told his pilots explicitly that if they tried to turn with a Zero, they'd die. If they used the P-47's weight and power to dictate vertical engagements, diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when necessary, they'd survive and win. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943. Using these tactics, he received the Medal of Honor for that mission. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons adopted similar techniques in early 1944. The Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most parameters except turning radius. Marine pilots operating from island bases like Munda and Vella Le Vella found that the inverted dive worked even better in the Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4 used powerful Pratt & Whitney R-2008 100-engine maintained thrust through negative G maneuvers, and the aircraft's structural strength meant pilots could pull out of dives at higher speeds without worrying about wing failure. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, teaching tactics to VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, demonstrated the maneuver repeatedly, emphasizing that it was a defensive escape tactic, not an offensive weapon. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific. Fighter pilots flying from carriers like USS Essex and USS Lexington received briefings that now included inverted maneuvers as accepted tactics. The official terminology varied. Some called it a split S, others referred to it as a negative G break, some simply described it as rolling out downward. The language didn't matter, the execution was consistent. When conventional defensive maneuvers failed invert and dive, the safety threshold remained around 80 feet. Below that altitude, pilots were instructed to use other escape options or accept that they were in a fight to the death. Not all aircraft types could safely perform the maneuver. Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots reported that their carbureted engines sometimes coughed or quit during sustained inverted flight, though they usually restarted quickly. Army Air Force P-40 pilots found their aircraft structurally sound for the maneuver, but lacking the dive performance to create sufficient separation from pursuing Zeros. These limitations meant that tactics remained aircraft-specific. A P-38 pilot could rely on the inverted dive as a primary defensive tool. A P-40 pilot needed different escape options. The underlying principle, however, had become universal across the theater. Vertical maneuvers, including inverted flight when necessary, beat horizontal turning fights every time. Japanese pilots eventually recognized the American inverted dive tactic and attempted to develop countermeasures. By late 1943, combat reports from returning Zero pilots mentioned American fighters rolling, inverted and diving away at high speed. Initial Japanese assessments viewed this as a purely defensive maneuver, evidence that American pilots feared close combat and were fleeing rather than fighting. This interpretation was strategically dangerous for Japanese airmen because it reinforced their existing tactical doctrine while missing the actual threat. The inverted dive wasn't retreat. It was a reset that allowed American pilots to choose when and how to re-engage on favorable terms. Some Japanese pilots tried following American fighters through inverted dives. The results were often fatal. The Zero's lightweight construction, which gave it superior turning performance, became a liability in high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft's airframe was stressed to positive G limits but had reduced safety margins in negative G flight. Several Zero pilots who attempted to follow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives experienced control surface flutter or structural failure. Others found that their Nakajima-Saki engines experienced fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, causing power loss at the worst possible moment, mid-dive, while trying to keep an enemy aircraft in sight. A documented incident from December 1943 over the Bismarck Sea illustrated the tactic's lethality when Zero pilots attempted to counter it. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Maguire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero achieved a firing position, Maguire rolled inverted and dove. The Japanese pilot followed, attempting to keep Maguire in his gunsight. Two things happened simultaneously. Maguire's P-38 accelerated past 450 mph in the dive while maintaining structural integrity, and the pursuing Zero began experiencing severe vibration around 380 mph. The Japanese pilot was forced to pull out early or risk airframe failure. Maguire leveled at 6,000 feet, climbed back into the fight with superior energy and shot down 2 of the 4 Zeros. The other 2 disengaged. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that their most effective aircraft, the Zero, was optimized for the wrong kind of combat by late 1944. Early in the war, when engagements occurred at medium altitudes and involved prolonged turning fights, the Zero's characteristics were ideal. But as American tactics evolved toward high-speed slashing attacks and vertical maneuvers, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant while its disadvantages, lack of armor, lightweight structure, lower dive speed, became critical vulnerabilities. Japanese aircraft designers recognized this problem. The later, Model Zero variants and newer designs like the J-2M Raiden had improved dive performance and stronger structures. But these aircraft arrived in limited numbers and too late to change the tactical balance. Japanese training programs couldn't adapt quickly enough either. By 1944, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. New pilots received abbreviated training that emphasized basic flight skills and traditional dogfighting tactics. There wasn't time or fuel to teach advanced energy management or vertical combat techniques. Meanwhile, American training programs had incorporated lessons from combat veterans. Replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific in late 1944 already knew about inverted dive tactics before they flew their first combat mission. The knowledge gap had reversed. Japanese pilots, once the most experienced in the theater, were now often the least prepared for the war's actual tactical environment. The inverted dive tactics developed over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945 didn't disappear when World War II ended. They became embedded in fighter tactics doctrine, though often without attribution to the desperate innovations of P-38 and Corsair pilots fighting for survival. Modern fighter combat training at institutions like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, includes negative G maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. The terminology has changed. Contemporary pilots call it a negative G pushover or unloaded roll, but the fundamental physics and purpose remain identical to what Thomas Lynch figured out over New Guinea in April 1943. The Korean War saw American pilots employing similar tactics against MiG-15s. The Soviet-built jet fighter had excellent high-altitude performance and could outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat. F-86 Sabre pilots facing analogous problems to what P-38 pilots encountered against Zeros used vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes when MiGs achieved advantageous positions. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 kills, credited his survival in several engagements to what he called rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, precisely the same inverted dive concept now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet and 600 mph. Vietnam-era fighter pilots rediscovered these lessons the hard way. Early in that conflict, American pilots trained primarily for beyond visual range missile but found themselves in close-range dogfights against nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21. The initial engagement results were poor. The establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station, Murrumur represented institutional acknowledgement that dogfighting skills, including negative, G defensive maneuvers, remained critically important despite technological advances. Instructors at Top Gun taught tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized immediately. Use your aircraft's strengths, avoid the enemy's advantages, and when defensive, go vertical and inverted if necessary. Modern fighter aircraft are designed with negative G capability built in. The F-16, F/A-18, and F-35 all have fuel systems, engine designs, and structural strength that allow sustained negative G flight without the limitations that plagued World War II aircraft. Pilots train in centrifuges to build tolerance for both positive and negative G forces. The red-out effect that terrified pilots in 1943 is now a known and manageable phenomenon, but the underlying principle hasn't changed. Negative G flight allows maneuvers that opponents don't anticipate, creating separation and opportunities for counterattack. What makes the Pacific War innovation remarkable is that it happened entirely outside official channels. No aeronautical engineer designed the tactic. No tactical development board approved it. No training command incorporated it into syllabi until after pilots had already proven its effectiveness through hundreds of combat engagements. It spread through the warrior network, experienced pilots teaching survival skills to new arrivals person to person, squadron to squadron. The men who developed these tactics didn't receive recognition beyond their immediate units. Most never knew their improvised solutions would influence fighter combat doctrine for the next 80 years. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, survived the war partly because he mastered vertical combat and wasn't afraid to fly inverted when circumstances demanded. Thomas Lynch, who first employed the tactic intentionally, was killed in action over the Philippines in March 1944. Not because his tactics failed, but because combat flying was statistically lethal, regardless of skill. Their legacy isn't in medals or official recognition. It's in the fact that fighter pilots today still train to roll inverted and push negative G when defensive, a direct lineage to desperate innovations made in cockpits over the Pacific where survival required rewriting the rules mid-flight. The true measure of this innovation's impact lies not just in its immediate survival rate, but in how it fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the air war. For the first year of combat, a chilling aura of invincibility had surrounded the Zero. American pilots, despite their bravery and training, often entered engagements with a defensive, almost fatalistic mindset, knowing they were facing a machine and a pilot that seemed to possess supernatural agility. The discovery of the inverted dive shattered this myth. It proved the Zero was not invincible. It had a physical and tactical Achilles heel that could be exploited. This shift from a mindset of survival to one of calculated counterattack was as important as any new aircraft model or improved weaponry. The confidence it instilled in young pilots was immeasurable. They now had a get-out-of-jail-free card, a move that, while terrifying to execute, gave them a fighting chance against a seemingly superior opponent. This newfound confidence translated into more aggressive and effective offensive tactics. Pilots became willing to take riskier shots, knowing they had a reliable method to break contact and reset the fight if it turned against them. The initiative, so long held by the Japanese, began to tilt back toward the Americans. This grassroots tactical evolution also highlighted a critical difference in the two air forces' institutional learning capabilities. The Japanese military structure, with its rigid hierarchy and deep-seated cultural emphasis on established doctrine, was slow to adapt. Lessons learned the hard way by their frontline pilots often failed to filter back up the chain of command to influence training or aircraft design in a timely manner. In contrast, the American system, for all its initial bureaucratic resistance, possessed a fluid, pragmatic undercurrent. While the inverted dive maneuver was never officially sanctioned in a top-down directive during the peak of the war, the U.S. military's culture of after-action reports, squadron, level debriefings, and the relative informality of its officer corps allowed for this vital knowledge to circulate and take root organically. It was a bottom-up revolution, validated not by generals but by the grim calculus of survival rates. Commanders like General George Kenney of the 5th Air Force were pragmatists. They cared more about results than regulations. When they saw squadrons employing the inverted dive were suffering fewer losses and achieving higher kill counts, they turned a blind eye to the technical violations of flight manuals. This tacit approval was all the permission the pilots needed. The legacy of these desperate maneuvers extends even into the realm of aircraft design. While the inverted dive was a tactical workaround for existing aircraft limitations, post-war designers took its lessons to heart. The next generation of fighters, like the North American F-86 Sabre, were built with energy maneuverability as a core principle, inherently capable in the vertical plane and designed to excel in the kind of high-speed, slashing attacks that P-38 pilots had been forced to invent. Furthermore, the physiological toll observed by flight surgeons like Captain Moorhead directly informed the development of improved G-suits and cockpit designs aimed at mitigating the effects of both positive and negative G-forces. The pilot's brutal, real-world experimentation provided invaluable data that formal research had missed, proving the human body was far more resilient than previously believed, provided the stresses were managed and understood. Ultimately, the story of the inverted dive is a timeless lesson in adaptation and the indomitable nature of human ingenuity under pressure. It underscores that in the crucible of combat, theory often shatters against the hard reality of experience. The men who rolled their aircraft upside down, their vision swimming in a sea of red, were not just saving their own lives. They were engaging in a raw, real-time form of research and development, rewriting the playbook one desperate maneuver at a time. They demonstrated that the most effective solutions are not always born in laboratories or strategy rooms, but in the minds of those facing existential threats, who are willing to challenge convention and push themselves and their machines beyond perceived limits. The faint, ghostly red spots that lingered in their eyes after landing were not just a mark of physical strain. They were a badge of honor, a testament to a moment where instinct, courage, and a willingness to defy the rules converged to create a new form of warfare. This legacy, written in the sky over the vast Pacific, continues to echo wherever pilots train, reminding them that sometimes the path to survival and victory lies not in running away, but in turning the world and the fight completely upside down.